Hey you guys, I'm here in my studio and I'm going to guide you through a black and white painting.
Let me get it without smearing it.
This is the painting we will be doing. We're only using black and white paint. If you didn't get black paint, you want to substitute in a different color. So like burnt umber brown would work or ultramarine blue. We're doing black and white because I want you to concentrate on two different things for this painting. The first is value. So when we put down paint stroke, I want you to think, does this need to be lighter or darker? I'm hoping that because of drawing, this is an easy question to ask, right? So I'm hoping that's not too overwhelming. And then the other thing I want you to concentrate on is just figuring out how you blend oil paint and how you don't blend oil paint. Now, being honest with you guys, I think you have the advantage over the acrylic painters because you'll see oil paint is so easy to blend. That's its strength. Actually, the opposite, not blending it, is a little tricky, but we'll figure that out together. Okay, you guys, you want to grab your paints, your canvas, your turpentine, your palette, and get set up. Okay, so the first thing you need is something to paint on. I'm using a canvas panel. This is a piece of wood that has canvas glued to one side. The next thing you'll need is a palette. I'm using an old mirror that has tape around the edges. It's a much well-loved palette, as you can see. And then you also need thinner. You should pour enough thinner into your glass jar that will cover the bristles of your paintbrush, so about 2 inches. And then I also have a painting rag. You will also need paint brushes as well in a variety of sizes. You need to have your paint. I'm using white and black oil paint. And then the last thing you need is just a pencil and an eraser to sketch in your painting at the start. Okay, so our first step is we're just going to sketch in the basic shapes or the basic painting. I just have like a ground plane, and then I have a space of white, and it's going to be surrounded by trees. So I'm just trying to put in that space of white to kind of remind myself that white paint is going to go in this area. I'm going to have a small figure also standing there. It's just an outline of a figure, so we don't have to be too worried about details. Now I'm going to lay out the paint on my palette. The most important thing is to put this paint so it's on the edges of your palette. We reserve the middle section of our palette for mixing paint. Because we're only using 2 colors today, it's not that big of a deal. I'm going to use a big brush, that's what I was showing you, and I'm going to block in the painting. I use thinner to thin out my paint so it's more watery and I can add it in quickly. So I dipped my brush first in the thinner, made a pool on my palette, and then dipped my brush into the colors that I wanted to have. So I'm just using white paint right now, so I put my brush in a little of the white and made this white watery mixture. I have my palette tipped up so you can see what I'm doing. Now I'm going to add some gray around on the other, like both sides of that white. So I'm mixing a gray watery mixture. In oil paint, like in any painting class, I can set it up into steps, but honestly, it's more about you just experiencing the paint and figuring out how to change it. So right now, I want you guys just to play around with adding thinner to your paint to see what that does. If you add a lot of thinner, it should get really watery. If you add just a little thinner, it should be less watery. In oil paint, we almost always start with a watery mixture and then we just build it up. The more layers we put on our painting, the less thinner we add to our painting. And then some people love really thick paint, so they would just keep on adding in paint on top of paint. But I'm trying to get paint on this canvas, and I'm still, in my head, I'm thinking of that idea of like keeping that center area pretty light, almost pure white, and adding gray beside it, I'm mixing a darker gray right now on my palette to the outside edges. When I put down the paint, and if it feels too thin, like, again, it's something that's hard to explain with words, you kind of have to experience, I can always dip my brush back in my thinner and add a few drops into my paint mixture. Okay, I'm gonna speed this up to double speed. So I'm just gonna keep on it's called blocking in, using this thinned out paint. My goal right now is to cover up the whole white of my canvas, or at least cover up any white that I don't want to remain white. So I'm gonna keep that center area white, but I need to cover all the edges of my canvas. And I'm just gonna use this thinner. I'm moving quickly to do it. A thinner and a big brush. And again, this is called thinned out oil paint when we do this. I'm just trying to remember to mix a range of grays. So this is only a value painting, right? Just white and black and gray. And probably the most important thing in a value painting, well, one of the most important things, is you really want to make sure that you're pushing yourself to get a range of value. So a strong painting will have black paint, it'll have white paint, and all different grays. A really boring painting is just going to have gray. So you want to keep on checking, make sure you've covered up your whole canvas, but then you also want to make sure that you have some black areas, some gray areas, and some white areas, and you don't just have gray. As you brush on the paint, also try to notice how we start blending. In oil, we blend color by brushing it back and forth, by brushing our paintbrush back and forth. Oil kind of naturally blends. Okay, so this is your reminder. Look at your painting. Do you need to increase, we would say, the range of value, the light to dark? We don't want just gray. So I'm going to keep on going. I'm trying to darken up the edges now. I'm a little worried that I'm saying we don't want gray, and I'm a little worried my painting's kind of gray right now. So I'm trying to add in some areas of darker gray so there's a little more drama going on. Okay, so my block in is all complete now, and I'm just going to wipe off my palette to get rid of that watery mixture. Now I'm going to go to just regular painting. I'm just no longer going to use thinned out paint. I'm going to mix some grays on my palette and then just put them in with a paintbrush. I actually like painting with a large paintbrush, so I'm keeping that size 8 brush as I make these strokes. I really want that area, that middle area, to be really bright, so I'm just using pure white paint. Okay, so I want to use pure white paint, and I kind of need to blend this more. So I have paint on my brush, I put it down, and then I just brush back and forth, blending the oil paint. Oil paint was invented during the Renaissance. It was invented actually in Germany or Holland. might be Holland. And it was amazing when the Italians figured out oil paint because up to then they had been doing fresco, which is really hot. Like it's on plaster, it dries really quickly. This process of having oil paint blend was like amazing magic to them. So right now I just want you to play around with putting more paint on the canvas and just playing around to how you can blend it together. Okay, I'm going to start drawing in some trees. So I'm going to get my smaller brushes. Before I do that, I'm going to try to lighten this up a little bit. So the danger of oil painting is it blends so easily. So sometimes you have to go back and re-add in your lights and re-add in your darks because they can just smush together. Okay, now I'm no longer using pure white. I'm just using a really light gray and I'm putting this around the bottom of the figure. I'm just trying to separate the figure from the background. Still thinking about that sense of that range of value, and I'm trying the darker color here. Okay, tree time. So I'm going to use a really light gray to sketch something in. Now we need to talk about something. When you mix a color, you're going to have it on your palette and it may look perfect. You don't know that color is perfect or not until you put it on your painting. So you mix a color on your palette and then you try a little on your painting and decide whether to continue using it or not. So I'm just drawing in some tree trunks. But I'm kind of running into problems because this top area of my painting is kind of uneven and weird looking. So I'm worried that branches won't show through because that top is so uneven. So I'm going to get a medium-sized brush and I'm going to get paint on my medium-sized brush and I'm just going to go back and forth with the paint, trying to even out the background. Medium size was too small. So now moving on to my bigger medium size. And I'm just trying to even this out. Because we started using thinned out paint, that has a tendency to dry very quickly. Thinner makes it dry as quick as 10 minutes or something. So if it needs more paint, I'll add in just regular paint on my brush. But most importantly, I'm just going to go back and forth. And then I get my smaller paintbrush and I add in those tree branches. I'm starting by the figure with a really light gray, and then I'm going to just add the tree trunks going out to the sides of the canvas. But as I move to the sides of the canvas, I will darken, like use a darker gray for my tree trunks. And I'm doing these tree trunks just mainly vertical, but I'm adding in a few diagonal lines towards the top. I'm having problems with my paint. It feels kind of clunky. So I'm just going to dip my brush into my thinner once again and just get a few drops of that thinner to add to my oil paint. We're still pretty early in the painting process, like I don't have too many layers, so it's fine to thin out my paint a little bit at this time, so just so it can flow more, so my stroke is easier to make. Okay, I'm just going to continue in this way, working my way to the edges. I'm using like a medium gray right now, and I'm going to add in some tree trunks on both sides. I'm also trying to, how would we say that? Like balance on both sides. What I do on the right, if I add some tree trunks there, I try to add approximately the same number also on the left in a similar color. And then I'm gradually working darker as I go. Right now I'm just looking to fill this space. If you know a little bit about perspective, that can help you. The laws of perspective would say that towards the middle of the painting, towards the vanishing point, there would be more trees and there would be less trees towards the sides. But I'm not really so worried about that. I'm just adding a lot of tree trunks at this point. And again, they're almost all vertical with some diagonal lines. I'm using one of my thinnest brushes to put these in, and I'm constantly, you're not seeing it, but I'm constantly adding a few drops of thinner to my paint to make it a little more liquidy. Okay, so at this point, you guys, I just want you playing around with putting paint on canvas. I tried to choose a pretty simple image so that if your tree trunks are bigger, if they're crazy crooked, it doesn't really matter. It's a forest, right? So there's not necessarily one right way and one wrong way to draw a tree. So just try to experience mixing different values or different shades of the gray and adding in these tree trunks. And in paint, if I don't want something to blend together and get all smeary, I just put the stroke down and kind of don't mess with it. So I'm not really going to go back and forth with these. I just try to put them down a little bit. Okay, now so I'm putting in my tree trunks, but I'm getting a little nervous about the bottom of my painting. So I'm going to add in, like I'm going to look at the tree trunks and then also add in some darker trees in front. If I have problems with making a mark, I can always use my other hand to steady my brush. I'm doing this with the canvas leaning against the wall. You could have your canvas flat and be leaning over it, like flat on a table. Some of my students do like to work that way. For this painting, you're just trying out the material and try to find a way that you're comfortable. In the perfect world, this is painting will be an activity that is enjoyable and not stressful. So you have to try to figure out, try different things, make it work for you. Okay, I'm still thinking about that value. So anytime we do a black and white painting, or we say monochromatic, one color painting, we have to make sure there's a range there. We have lights of that color and darks. So I'm adding in some darker trees to try to make the painting a little more interesting. that little postcard is Pontormo's Angel from the Annunciation, but it's an Italian artist called Pontormo. Okay, so I need to remember in my head as I'm painting this that one of the main ideas of this painting is it's light in the middle and then it gets darker on the outside. So I have to remember to add some darker trees towards the edge of my canvas. Now, this painting is like an okay painting, but I wish I had added even more darker trees than I did. So you might want to go a little crazy and add a lot more. I'm just going to continue to add in trees. I'm looking, the idea is a forest, but I guess it's kind of a personal thing. Like, how much of a forest do you want to make it? So you just add in trees where you feel like your individual painting needs trees. This is going to be another topic that we're going to talk about all semester long, but at a certain point, you have to look at your canvas and decide what your canvas needs, you know? So I'm not telling you do like exactly 7 trees on the left side and 6 trees on the right. It's up to you. And that's dependent on like how big of a tree trunks you put in, how crowded you individually want your forest to look like. In art, we have choices, but choices are also freedom. Okay, I'm still worried about I keep on focusing on my trees and forgetting about the top, like the bottom of my canvas. So I'm gonna go back there and I'm gonna darken it even more. I should have said though, as you add in your trees, like make sure you're adding in different grays. Like it's not all one gray. Make sure there's all a range of grays. Okay, and then how dark your figure is painted is going to determine how close or how far away that figure feels to us. So I'm going to use like a medium dark gray for the figure, but if you want the figure to feel a little further away, you would use a lighter gray. Atmospheric perspective tells us that as things go in the distance, they become, do you know this? They become usually lighter and bluer. That's why when we drive on a freeway, we're surrounded by all these blue mountains around us because they're really far away in our atmosphere. So anytime you're painting, and if you want it to make it look further away from you, you would make it a little lighter, and if you make it bluer too, that kind of gives us the idea that it's further away. So when we use color, we will say you make something cooler to make it look farther away. I'm just still adding tree trunks for the rest of my life, it feels like. Okay, so we're going to work on this top part a little bit. I'm going to try to add more branches coming out of these trunks. So I'm going to use my smallest brush, and I'm going to try to have a really light touch. The harder I press on a paintbrush, the thicker the stroke is. So if I want really thin brushes, I have to have a really light touch and try to do it in one continuous stroke. So it's a nice, thin, smooth, elegant line. Again, if your paint is acting weird, you can always play around with how much thinner you should add to the mixed paint. slowly starting to look more like a forest. And make sure, once again, that you vary your grays, right? I'm doing like a medium gray right now. Okay, this is an important concept that we'll also be talking about more as the semester goes on. But partway through our painting, like sometimes it might be like you leave the painting for a day and then you come back the next day. You want to step back and look at your painting and decide how you want to change it. Painting is your own little world that you're creating. So if you're following this demo or you have a photograph reference, you're always never tied. That's so many adverbs in that sentence. You are never tied to doing exactly what that photo shows. There's freedom in that, and you can decide by stepping back and see what your painting needs. This painting needs a little more drama, so I'm going to darken the bottom again to try to amp up that range of value. I'm going to continue making small branches, but halfway through this, I figured out, wait, if I turn this upside down, it'll be way easier to do strokes. When we touch our canvas to the paint, when we touch our brush to the canvas, it puts the thickest amount of paint. That's usually the darkest part of the mark. And as we drag our brush down the canvas, that mark will get lighter. So I'm starting at the tops of the tree trunks and dragging them down. Now, some of these tree trunks, they're all wonky looking. So I'm remixing the background color and putting it around the tree trunks to kind of clean up the edges. This is kind of dangerous because you can get carried away and mess your painting up. So be careful about this, but it is something that you can do. That's what I'm doing right now. You can see with a small brush, I'm just trying to repaint that gray around the tree trunks to kind of clean them up a little bit. And I can also do it in the really tiny tree branches, but you run the risk of putting the wrong background color in this tight space and it can just mess up your painting. So again, be cautious about this. Okay, you guys, we're coming towards the end of this. I don't know how much more to do on this. I did this all in one setting. You might want to use a couple days to do this, like one day for the block in, one day for the putting in tree trunks, another day for the tree branches, and then let it dry and then come back and add like touch it up a little, but it's up to you how you do that. I don't want to leave those tree branches. I just keep on adding to them with the smallest brush. Make sure your branches go off the canvas. Okay, and then this will be our final painting then. So it should look something like that. Okay, I wanted to show you guys how to clean up when you're done. So I have my palette, I'm leaning it up. I have a large area of mixed grays. It's kind of confusing because my palette's so used, but I'm getting a straight blade knife and I'm just scraping off those mixed grays. What you want to get in the habit of doing is scraping off your mixed color. You want to leave your palette nice and smooth. And it's really easy to clean it when the painting is, when the palette is wet and the paint's wet on it. I also scraped off my black because it was a weird mixture. My white, I'm going to leave on the palette. I don't know if you can see that. That's a chunk of white paint. And it will be probably wet for like a week. So if you're going to paint in less than a week, I would just leave that paint on there. If you're going to not paint for 2 weeks, I'd take that white paint and throw it away. But if I'm going to paint soon, like in a couple days, I'm just going to leave a large chunk of paint on my palette. That's it. Thanks, you guys.